Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our continual study on how to read the Bible, or how to study the Bible might be a better way of putting it. This evening, I'm going to run over a few slides that I'd done last week and the week before as a way of remembering some of the details. But we will deal mostly with Psalms, somewhat with Proverbs, depending on how much time we have this evening. I'm going to do something a little bit more unique. Those of you who have never read the Song of Solomon, I'm going to touch on that because it was requested that I do. Most unique text, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Next week, though, is my intent to run through the book of Revelation. So if you've got questions, that's your opportunity. It's different kind of a text. It's not as difficult as most people try to make it to be. It uses language, I suppose, different than graphic pictures. It's sort of like the Star Wars of the Bible, if you will. Instead of having movie and theatrics that way, he uses words to describe images. And most of those images, by the way, come from the Old Testament. And almost the entire text of Revelation is extracted from the Old Testament. Again, I can't say it enough times, our New Testament texts deal a great deal with the Old Testament, and so we really need to be studying the Old Testament. And we have to study it within the culture that it was given, the history that was behind it, the verbiage that was behind it, and the motivation behind the author and his audience for the Old Testament. Psalms is no different, and we'll get into that in a moment. But how to study the Bible, it's a hermeneutics. Again, it's just a verbiage of how to bring the text forward, if you will, from all the centuries, 1500 BC to through the first century. The text can never mean what it never could have meant to the authors and readers. We cannot look at a text, or should not look at a text, and make the assumption of what it means, and if it's greater than what it meant to the author and audience, then we have extracted something that was not meant to be there. It might sound good, we might be motivated by it, but it isn't what was written to the audience and what it was meant to be. And our objective should always be to find out what it was that the author was trying to write, what he expected the audience to receive, and the motivation behind both of those. And that should be our desire to learn. Can we make a contextual movement with it? That is, can we bring it forward into the 21st century? Absolutely. Everything about the text, the Bible, can be brought forward into the 21st century. But we need to do it within the meaning of what the author and text was written during their times. Now, the reason the Bible is sometimes so hard to understand is because, and we'll go into the next. The reason the Bible was so difficult to understand, at times it wasn't written to you, it was written for us, or for you. And for that reason alone, we need to find out what's applicable to us, what kind of lesson or thought process we can pull out of it to avoid any of the complications of leaning on where the Bible came from, and it can mean anything anybody wants it to. It doesn't. It's not the way to read the Bible. It wasn't the way it was written. And anyone making that kind of a statement, that kind of conclusion, are doing themselves a disservice. And again, the text can never mean more to us than it did the first century. Where does the meaning reside? With the author, in the text, or if you will, with the reader. Well, it resides in all three. Obviously, the author had an objective the text facilitated that, and the audience received it. And the meaning is within all three. And we need desperately always to find what that meaning is. And as I said earlier, we really cannot ignore the Old Testament. Our brotherhood in particular is notorious for that. And we miss a great deal of the New Testament teaching the moment we do that. And we miss a great deal of our understanding of what God is all about if we ignore the Old Testament. Our guidelines for the Old Testament determine what the Old Testament meant to the audience, determine differences and similarities in the ancient biblical times with the 21st century. We need to compare those always, find specific ways that the Old Testament principles for our lives today, and not looking into others, but into our own lives. The literary, historical, cultural context in the Old Testament is a narrative story. Invariably, we find narrative stories in the Old Testament. They're not written quite like the epistle or the letters are written in the New Testament, but they have something to say. They have a great deal to say. And with the number one guideline always is God's revelation of himself. If you don't believe in God, and there are those who online, I think, that fall in that category, then understand that the Bible was written that way. It was written by authors who sincerely believed in God and everything that they did. And as far as the discussion about God, I'll be happy to have it with somebody. I'm not going to have it in this lectureship. But if you're reading the Old Testament without a belief in God, understand that the authors did sincerely believe in God. And they felt as though God was the impetus behind everything. And so when you're reading what they've written, you need to understand that. I'm not telling you have to accept it, but you need to understand it in order for it to gain a great deal from the Old Testament while you're doing it. Quickly, the Old Testament law was God's fully inspired word, not God's direct command to us. It was law based on the Old Covenant, Israel's history. Old Testament law is not binding in the New Covenant except as renewed in the New Testament. I think I said it last week, though. We talk about the 10 Commandments as belonging to the Old Testament. 9 of those 10 Commandments are repeated in the New Testament. So when we pull them out, when we're looking at the commandments, we need to look at them and think in terms of a New Testament era. God's mercy is seen in the Old Testament. Old Testament law example. Old Testament law examples of expected behavior, yes. If the law was complete, not comprehensive. I mean, we find passages, Deuteronomy 22 comes to my mind, but we find the passages, they don't answer everything, they give us a principle. If you're a farmer and you see your neighbor's cow gets lost, you try to salvage it. You try to do something about it. Does it talk about sheep in that passage? No. Did they have sheep? Yes. Is the principle there? Absolutely. So it isn't trying to dictate every item of life. It's trying to give you principle, much like the New Testament does, by the way. In terms of the prophets that we talked a little bit about, well, a whole lot about last week, and prophesying, there's 4 major ones, 12 what they call minor. They're not minor in value, they're minor in terms of the quantity. And so when the Jewish group put the Old Testament together, they categorized the minor ones, put them in one text, and it ends up being as large as one of the major ones. Again, we sometimes fall into the trap in terms of prophesying, that we think in terms of always in the future, way off into the future. Well, we got to remember 90% of the text in the Old Testament and the prophets were about the immediate future to those he was writing to. It is, with very few exceptions, and there are some, but very few exceptions, most of what was being committed in terms of vocabulary to these people were, this is going to happen unless you do something else. And most of the prophets talk about that. So it is, when we're reading it, we got to think in terms of what was their history, what was their concerns, when did they prophesy. That takes a lot of work. Yes, it does. But it is not invaluable. It is a great deal of value for you to understand what was going on and therefore make the application to yourselves. And I just ahead myself a little bit. Yeah, reading the prophets well in their historical context is going to take some time and effort. It is not simple. It can be done. And there's things available for you to do that. We talked a little bit about it. The study Bible is the first thing that I would recommend with it. Commentaries later, Bible dictionary, concordances, all of those kinds of things are valuable in terms of you reading your Bible effectively. And if you want to read it effectively and make application to your own life, then you need to pick up where the Old Testament was at, what the prophets were talking about, and remember the themes. Again, the prophets and their vocabulary and what they communicated to the people was not their verbiage. It was God that was inspired them. It was not something they developed. And invariably it calls for the people to come back to God's relationship, the faithfulness that they hadn't been showing, and cause God's eternal kingdom. It's the hope that's valuable there. This thing is going to happen. There's Jeremiah, of course, one of the major prophets, was prophesying the destruction of the first temple era. Nebuchadnezzar did that in 586 BC. He took the whole Palestinian area several years before, 605 BC. And Jeremiah said, you've got to live with this. Don't try to fight with it. God's punishing us. Go with the Babylonians. And you would think that's a negative, and certainly he was put down in holes and separated and tortured, and etc. But Jeremiah did something really special before he died. He went out and bought property. Now that doesn't sound anything unusual, but if you know that there's a war coming, and in old times when the war came, it wasn't, they were going to rebuild and something will eventually come back. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed everything. And he knew that was going to happen. He was predicting that it was going to happen. But he said, in 30 some odd years, you're going to need property. You're going to go back home in 30 some odd years. And I'm buying this property. Now, he didn't live long enough to use the property, but his heirs did. He was showing that God was going to give him hope. That eventually God was going to pull him back. After you spent the time in captivity learning what you should be doing with God, then you're going to come out of that. And they did. 539 BC, Cyrus took Babylon, took it over. He was a Persian, and he released the Israelites and a whole bunch of other nations, by the way, that the Babylonians had captured, and said, you can go home. It wasn't a financial thing. He just thought it was more effective if he allowed that to happen, and it worked out pretty good for him. We don't need to dwell on this too much. Again, prophets were God's representative. The message was not original. It was part of what they was given. And in most cases, the prophets were never really interested in prophesying. They weren't. Jeremiah got all disturbed. They're not listening to me, is what he would say. And we see and hear from several of the prophets saying the same kind of thing. Stephen makes that prediction in the 8th chapter of Acts. When, you tortured your prophets. You didn't bother to listen to them. That was the history behind some of this that took place. The prophets, it wasn't a good job. They had a very difficult time doing what God wanted them to do, but they did it. You want a lesson? That's our lesson. It's not always easy to represent God. Now we're going to get into the Song of Songs, Songs of Solomon. This is a unique text in a lot of ways. It is one of the two texts that doesn't have God's name in it. Esther's being the other one. But again, in Wisdom and Song of Solomon, it's a wisdom text, but in addition to that, it is a song of love. And if you read it, it is a song of marriage. It is a song of relationship in its entirety. Is it a bit graphic? Absolutely. This is usually why it's not taught very much. But it is still one of love for one another. It's a love between a female and a male. And the descriptions are very much that way. It's a ballad of human romance. And there are a lot of the songs. We don't have very many, but this one in the text. Ezekiel talks about it a little bit, 33rd chapter, I believe. And he's talking, all you do is go around singing. Well, he was criticizing them because they were singing love songs. We know that they existed, but we have this one. Why? Because there's, and that's a good question, I guess, because there are those historically that felt like that this should not have been in the Bible. Mostly why it's in there is because it was associated with Solomon. That's why it's called Song of Solomon or Song of Songs. Some of the initial critics, late 1800s or early 1900s, would suggest to you that this was written a lot later, that it could not possibly have been written during the time of Solomon. And they had some reasons. Most of them are fallen by the wayside now because it looks like there's no question that this text actually came from the 800, 900 BC period of time. It mentions some cities that didn't exist in the 300 period of time, for example. And during this, if you read through this song. And of course, the fact that it's overtly sexual in nature. But it is a love story. And it ought to be taken as much. And as much as anything else. For example, I've got the fourth chapter, a few verses there, and I'm going to read those. How beautiful you are, my darling. Oh, how beautiful. Your eyes behind your veil are doves. Your hair is like a flock of goats descending from the hills of Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of sheep just shorn, coming from the washing. Each has its twin. Not one of them is alone. Your lips are like scarlet ribbon. Your mouth is lovely. Your temples are behind your veil, are like the halves of a pomegranate. Your neck is like the Tower of David, built with courses of stone, and on it hang 1,000 shields, all of them shields of warriors. In our time period, if you will, romance is looked upon as preceding marriage in a lot of cases, primarily feelings of pleasure. And yet the Song of Solomon says something different. It says romance can actually be characterized and idolized with a marriage. It's a special text, and it ought to be read as much. We can appreciate everything that's in there in our relationships with our spouses in particular, which is why it was written and why I think it's part of it. Let's get into what I would call the poetry and wisdom, if you will, part of our lecture this evening. Our love for Psalms continues on. It has always been that we enjoy the Psalms. Perhaps why it's one of the largest texts we have. But it isn't just in our time period. I've got abbreviation up there, the Dead Sea Scrolls. I put the wrong abbreviation, didn't I? Anyway, it should be DSS, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Most of those scrolls, all of them were written before 50 AD was one of our last ones, and they were started about 160, 175 BC. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we, of course, and those of you who aren't quite familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls, those are what we've dug up in 1947 and found 11 caves of them, and we've just since the 90s have finally gotten around to translating them. But in those are nearly 40 texts of the 200 that we have are Psalms. This group of theologians, and that's really what they were doing there, they just copy us, felt like the Psalms were of a great value to copy them that many times and have that many copies of them, of the Psalms. So Psalms, as we understand them, were something that they liked. It was something that we have continued to like, and most of us have heard the 23rd Psalm, which comes to mind. I started to say something about my military background with that, but we'll pass on that. But the 23rd Psalm also has a couple items in it that David was very familiar with and would not. Sheep are one of the dumbest animals we have. And it wasn't that he was putting up the sheep as something that we ought to aspire to. It is that the sheep needed their shepherd in a very desperate way. And they do so today. You don't herd sheep, although in the 23rd Psalm you'll find the word herd in there. You don't herd sheep, and he knew that. But it's a guidance, if you will. And when we look at the 23rd Psalm, when we think about it, think in terms of us needing our divine Father. And that's really what the 23rd Psalm is all about. They provide hope and joy, if you will. We've got a whole range of emotions. Now understand this. Psalms are not written like epistles. They're not written like some of the other texts we find. They are verbiage to give you graphical presentations in your mind that you feel the psalm, feel what the author is trying to write. There are human words, if you will. There are human words to God, if you will, about God and questioning God. They're heartfelt words of how the person who was writing them felt. David wrote probably nearly half of them. Solomon, we've got a couple of them that he wrote. Moses has one, and there's a few others, and the rest of them we really don't know much about. Do we know the time period which they were written? Obviously, we know David's time period, 1000 BC, 900 something, but use 1000 for a nice round number to remember. Him and Solomon, 1000 BC. Obviously, we know when those two had to be written. But the rest of them, we don't necessarily know the history. So we're missing that part that I kept saying over and over again that we need. We need to know the history behind. We don't know all the history behind the Psalm, but that's not as critical as it was for the other text, because the Psalms are giving us a heartfelt message that's applicable at any time. So we look at it, see what they were talking about, and try to pick up on it. Now, they're written a little bit differently than, poetry. Hebrew poetry was written quite a bit differently. For example, they enjoyed acoustics, which is basically taking parts of it and adding letters from the alphabet. Hebrew has 22 letters in the alphabet. Psalms 119 comes to mind right away. You'll see sections, I believe it's 8 sections in 119, and they go through the letters, the Hebrew letters at each one. So it starts out with the letter in some form. If the author has forced the verbiage to use the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, which is kind of neat. And when you read it, then you understand that. The Psalms are broken up in 5 separate books. And most of that organization wasn't done initially. It was done after the Babylonian captivity, which they came out of there, like I said, 535, 536 BC. And as they started building back the temple, etc., it was 521. And after that period of time, call it very early, very late 500s, early 400s, they started putting the Psalms together. Now, do we get private devotionals in the Psalms? Yes, but a significant portion of them was used in public worship. For example, if you look at 136, Psalm 136, there's a verbiage that you can almost see the choir director, if you will, saying and the public responding. And it goes a saying, and then his steadfast love endures forever. And then the very next paragraph, same kind of thing. Something is listed, and his steadfast love endures. It was a repeat some 26 times through that one Psalm of 136. Now the hymns the songs are broken up, and I've given you some idea here of what they're all, each one. Hymns, praise songs to God for who He is and how He revealed Himself. Thanksgiving psalms, if you will, usually in the first person. I thank you, Lord, for everything that you have done in the past. And those psalms are written. Historical psalms, 105, 106 come to mind if you want to look those up. And they tell us what God has done, even with Israel's rebellion. So we get a little bit of history with that kind of a psalm. Lament psalms. Why, oh Lord, am I having problems? And how many of us have had that same kind of feeling? Why am I having difficulties, oh Lord? What is the reason behind it? I need to talk to you about it. That's precisely what these psalms are all about. The majority of the psalms are laments, if you will. Imprecatory psalms is putting up with somebody else. That my neighbor's a pain. That's God, can you do something about it? A good example, 137, and I say good, it's an example, a little bit graphic. It talks about, why haven't you taken Babylonian babies and smashed their heads against the wall, because that's what they did to us. And they're saying, God, you don't exist. And yet you're allowing them to do that. When are you going to do something about it? That's what an imprecatory psalm really is all about. It's a lament to a large degree. It's complaining to God about what your situation. It's talking to God. And that's what the psalms are all about. Thank you, Lord, for what you've done. Lord, you haven't done what the promise seemed to be. What am I doing wrong? That kind of a discussion. And then, of course, we get the Messianic royal psalms. And there's several of those, 18, 20, 21, 42, 72, 101, 121, and 142, I believe, are all the Messianic psalms. Different people put different categories on them. What are they? They are psalms that has to do with the royalty of Israel at the time and the projection, if you will, of what we look at in the New Testament of Jesus. So we have 6 or 8 of those in the Psalms. The question that we ought to be asking every time we read it on the Psalms is, what were they doing? What was the objective behind it? That's no different than some of the other texts we've already done. What was the audience response? And what is mine? When I read that, what am I doing with this psalm? Am I talking to God about the difficulties I have in my life? Does it tell me that I'm not that unique? Does it tell me that just because I'm having problems isn't something that's necessarily unique to me, that there were others, historically there were others with difficulties? David gets down and has a long talk, if you will, with God when he was lost a child, if you will, with an adultery issue. It's my fault, God. I messed up. Why are you taking out on them? That's a discussion that he has. Psalms 42, 43, by the way, probably should have been left together. As the deer pants, we've got a song that uses that. It's a lament, if you will. And we get the history behind that particular lament in 2 Kings 24, 25. So if you want to read a much more textual kind of response, look at 2 Kings 24, 25. And it really is what's talking about Psalms 42 and 43. Another key thing about Hebrew poetry is the parallelism. They tend to write their poetry in groups. So you get a sentence that says one thing, a little bit different verbiage, but it's saying the same thing. It's not trying to describe the first sentence as much as a repeat of the first sentence. So when you're reading the Psalms, think in terms of that. This is from the New International American Standard Bible, and it's from Psalms 1, and it provides us a little bit of a thought process of what the author is trying to do that you might not pick up as quickly. So I'm putting it up here, and we'll talk about it for just a minute or two. How blessed is the man who does not walk, I highlighted walk there, in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, or sit in the seat of scoffers. What the author is really trying to get you to do is avoid what he's written down here. He's saying at first you walk into this situation, now you're standing there, and now you're sitting down within a group of people that you should not be. You do not want to be around sinners. You do not want to be around the wicked. You do not want to be around scoffers, if you will. You should have your delight, if you will, in the law of the Lord. And in his law he meditates day and night. He will make like a tree firmly. That is, don't stay with the sinners. Don't stay with the scoffers. Stand like a tree planted with streams of water, which yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. And in whatever he does, he prospers. But they are like chaff, which the wind drives away. The wicked are them. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of righteousness. You do not want to walk with him. You don't want to stop, which is what he's saying, standing. That's the impression that he's trying to give. And you certainly don't want to sit down and take up residence with him, because it is to your detriment if you do that. The way of the wicked will fail. Fortunately, we have some comparison, if you will. It comes from Judges, of all things. We see the Song of Deborah, if you will, and it is a discussion regarding, in the 4th chapter, a discussion of Judges, a discussion regarding what happened with the battle. It's a little more detailed. It's a little more like a novel or a text that you might be reading in history. And then you get the song in the 5th chapter. When you, Lord, went out from, and this is the song, when you, Lord, went out from when you marched from the land of Edom, the earth shook, the heavens poured, the clouds poured down water, the mountains quaked before the Lord, the one of Sinai before the Lord of God. Now, did any of that happen if you read the story about it? No. They didn't talk about earthquakes. That's not how it happened. It was a battle. But he's trying to give you the feel for what this is all about. That God was in charge of this. That's what really happened. And we felt God, and we were successful because they were going up against an army that they would not have been able to conquer. Again, if we understand the story behind it, and you can read the history part of it, you can start to compare authors writing regarding the song that they're trying to say, trying to give us word pictures for, instead of, we got television, they had word pictures. And they're trying to graphically portray what had occurred. Now, Hebrew poetry is a little bit different. Rhyme, etc., repetitive is lost in the English translations, too much of it. NIV is making some effort with some of their newer rework, the 2011 translation. But too often we end up losing the poetry and the rhyme and the repetitiveness that is in that in the Psalms. And so we need to read it carefully. Too many times we look at Psalms, if you will, and we assume it's just like the epistles or some of the other texts in the Old Testament, that it's God's word to us and it's from God to the people, for what God wants us to do. But we miss the graphical part of the Psalms, and that's what they're trying to provide it. They are to God, and they are about God. So the author invariably is trying to tell us what the heart is trying to feel. It is heart-driven in parallelism. Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they reveal knowledge. Feel God's omnipotence there and the work that he's done. Feel the creation that's around you. And just resonate on the psalm that when it's written that way. Remember this, they sang these songs. Psalms are musical. They appeal to the emotions. They evoke feelings, if you will. Allows the Psalms to do what was originally intended to do, prompting us to stop, momentarily recognize the incredible greatness and goodness of our Creator. Psalms of vocabulary or poetry. They're purposely metaphorical. They're meant to be that way. A description of God, if you want. Mountains leap like the rams. Enemies spew out words from their lips. God seen as a shepherd, a fortress, a shield, a rock, etc., etc. Understand that when you're reading the Psalms, you are being given a picture, and you want to think in terms of that picture. The types of Psalms that we can get into, I suggested earlier, they're thanksgiving. Lord, thank you for what you have done for me in the past. The past event. The laments are complaints. They are songs that we're raising issues. We have praise psalms of what God you have accomplished. And we got a historical one. Here's what happened. And we're celebrating. And we got the wisdom song, if you will, that comes with those psalms. Psalm 3, if you will, is a lament. If you want to look that up with me. Lord, how many are my foes? Now, when David writes this, he's writing it at a time when he's disgruntled, he's got difficulties, and he's saying, Lord, how many are my foes? Just feel what David's trying to... How many rise up against me? I have no idea how many there are. But there are many of them, God. Do something about it. Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him. But you, Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts my head high. I'll call out to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy mountain. I lie down and sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me. I will not fear, though tens of thousands assail me on every side. Arise, O Lord, deliver me, my God. Strike all my enemies on the jaw. Break the teeth of the wicked. From the Lord comes deliverance. It's a song in which David was feeling the pressures of trying to run a country. We feel those kind of pressures every day, whether it's on our jobs or whether it's around people. These psalms are written there for our value in the 21st century. When we're feeling low, grab Psalms and start reading. 138 is a Thanksgiving psalm. And it's set up essentially the same. There's an introduction, if you will. There's a distress. There's an appeal. And there's a testimony. The introduction, the psalm's testimony, is how God has helped him. And the distress is the situation in which God's deliverance is portrayed. The appeal, he reiterates his appeal to God. God, we really need to do something about this because I'm having serious difficulties. And then we usually get a description of the deliverance. Again, this is Psalm 138. The deliverance God provided is described. And the testimony, of course, is a praise for God's mercy. Excuse me a second here. I got slides sticking. And imprecatory, I mentioned it earlier, Psalm 137, verses 7 to 9. Again, an imprecatory is that which says, do something about this. It's not just complaining to God about my situation. It is, I see this out there, God, and we need to be doing something about it. Verse 7, remember, again, this is Psalm 137. Remember, Lord, what the Edomites did. Now, to add a little history to that, when Nebuchadnezzar took took Jerusalem and they destroyed it, the Edomites ran in. They were living close to them and took everything that they could get. So it says, remember, Lord, what the Edomites did. On the day Jerusalem fell, they tear it down, they cried. Tear it down to its very foundations. Daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction. Happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. You have to wonder about that kind of a psalm from a writer and whether God approved it or not. But that is the kind of psalm that sometimes we'll find in which they're begging God for the promises that he has made, and the destruction of Babylon, they're waiting for it to happen more rapidly, and of course eventually does. Cyrus takes Babylon. He doesn't destroy it very much, by the way. He snuck in, got it pretty easily. So what do we gain from the Psalms? Well, first, Psalms can serve us as a guide to our worship. We see that in terms of its praise of God. We see that in terms of what God has done. We see that in a number of ways in which he has affected our lives and will continue to affect our lives. Secondly, Psalms we can relate honestly to God. I've got a problem, God. Let's have a talk about it. Those of you who have not done that in terms of your prayer, look at the Psalms, find those kinds of pleadings out, and use it for yourself. And third, if you will, Psalms gives us an importance of reflection, mediation of what God has done for us. It gives us the time to sit down and think about it. and consider all the positive things in our lives, even though we're dwelling with negativism at any point. A very negative psalm, you probably don't need any more than that, but Psalm 88 all the way through is a very negative psalm. I've got all these problems, God, you're not doing anything, on and on and on. It's a very negative psalm. And yet we come right out with the next one's talking about all the things God has accomplished in our lives. Let's take a few minutes and just touch on Proverbs, and if I got any seconds left, I'll address Ecclesiastes, which is very unique as well. Our minister last week talked about a fool. Travis was describing wise, and a few weeks before, and then last week he talked about a fool. And Psalms and in Proverbs, the 14th chapter, verse 7, stay away from a fool, for you will not find knowledge on your lips. Now, how do we look at the Proverbs? We need to understand something. Biblical proverbs, if you will, are short, pithy kind of expressing a wise and general truth concerning life with the divine perspective. What do I mean by that? It says that they're short kind of things that we can easily remember. They're not guarantees. If you're reading Proverbs and it says, if you're wise and you stay there, you're going to be healthy, wealthy, and wise. We're not promised any of those things. That's not what they're all about. Generally, if we do those kinds of things, staying with God and accomplishing and treating others as well, then generally things are going to be all right. But not always. Not always. They weren't for them either. They were the kind of things that remind me of what I ought to be doing when I really don't want to do them. It's the kind of things to remind me of what God has done around me and for me when I really am not listening very well. That's what the Proverbs are for. Stay away from the fool, you will not find knowledge there. It isn't that you're not supposed to be helping somebody that's a handicap. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about somebody that says, I don't believe in God. Somebody that says, I don't understand. I don't accept that. I want to treat people any way I want to. They're not honoring other people, if you will. And so what does the proverb say? You're not going to find knowledge in that kind of situation. Information? Yes. Knowledge? No. That's what that short little passage says. Stay away from the fool, for you will not find knowledge on your lips. And again, Proverbs are not legal guarantees from God. You look at Proverbs 22:26, if you will, 29, 12, 15, 25. Again, that's Proverbs 22, verse 26 to 27, 29 and 12, and 15, 25. I could have put out lots of them, but again, these are examples. They're not legal guarantees from God. When we read the Proverbs, they should be read as a collection, if you will, not just a piece out of context. You can't pull those out of context and get the full meaning behind them. And Proverbs are worded so that they're memorable, if you're not. They're not theoretically accurate, but they're memorable. They're the kinds of things that are going to come to your mind, if you will. Some Proverbs need to be translated. Yes, some of them are a little more difficult. That's true. You'll find it. But there's so much there that you can grasp if you just read through them with a feeling that they're supposed to be given. Not looking for answers for wealth, not looking for answers for health, looking for answers to relate to God. A higher being, divine in nature. That's what the author was writing. And again, if you don't accept the fact that God exists, then he was writing because he did believe in God. He did accept the fact that God existed. And he's telling the people that the best way to go about life is to find relationships with one another, if you will, and with God in particular. And yeah, Proverbs are often parabolic. What do I mean by that? They're figurative. They're pointing beyond themselves. They're expanding in themselves. They're intensely practical. They try to give, they're not theoretically theological, if you will. Boy, that one's tongue-tied. But they are practical. If I go about doing this, I most likely will have a good life. Not a guarantee, but most likely. They're not designed to support selfish behavior. Just the opposite, if you will. Proverbs may use highly specific language. They're trying to give us an idea through words. Not logical effort, not trying to convince you of logic, but trying to get you to feel the meaning behind them. Ecclesiastes, let me touch on that just a little bit. My effort with Ecclesiastes was difficult. I had one text, one semester, in which I had to translate the entire book of Ecclesiastes from Hebrew, strictly from Hebrew. My Hebrew was almost non-existent, still is, but I managed to do it, like all of the rest of us do. But when we look at Ecclesiastes, we say, wow, what's he trying to say? On the one hand, he begins and says, Abba, everything is illusion. There's nothing I can grasp a hold of. Technically, the word H-E-B-E-L really means breath or vapor would be even a better word. I reach out to get it and it's not there. I can't grasp a hold of it. Life is all, that's all life is what he says. And yet he ends up in the 12th chapter and says what? Okay, I've come finally to a conclusion. Everything is summed up in the fact that we ought to be doing what God wants us to do, and if we do that, it'll probably be okay. But you go all the way through Ecclesiastes and you pick up that. It is certainly a different kind of a text. We're not entirely certain, even when it was written. And mostly we assign it to Solomon because of the wisdom of Solomon, but not somewhat. It looks like the verbiage might have been a little bit later. But in any case, it is that which is giving us wisdom. It is trying to say life isn't always the way that we want to make it to be. That whenever we have those kind of problems, we should step back and think, well, others have had it. The Ecclesiastes writer, the author, if you will, is trying to convey to us that life is not simple. And we say, well, I know that. I found that out, Howard. I don't need to read something. But what he is saying is that if we reorient ourselves around God, then we will be able to effectively run our lives. And that's really all that Ecclesiastes is saying. The other wisdom book, we probably have a few minutes here, is Job. And when we read Job, again, it's a wisdom book that is different. He is somebody that has done well because he has adhered to God, and things start to happen to him, and his friends sit around and give him all kinds of suggestions, none of which are real good, and tell him that he had to have done something wrong, and he's not willing to he's not willing to accept that because he can't look into his life and say, well, I don't know what it was. Does Job eventually have some difficulties, and God, why am I having these problems? And he talks to God about it, and then God gives that magnificent statement, and I believe it's the 40th chapter of Job. Were you around when I made the stars? Were you around when I made the earth? Were you around when the trees grew? And Job says, oh, no, I don't guess I was. And then we get the wisdom of Job, that we can relive the very best life we have, and sometimes it doesn't come out quite the way we want it to. That does happen to us. That happens to our friends. It happens to us individually. It happens to anyone, if you will. And sometimes we see people seem like they can do all kinds of things wrong, and life just seems to be passing them very well with them. We don't have answers for all of that. That's not what Job was all about. What Job was all about is saying, I have a relationship with God. I know I have that relationship with God. And when difficulties come, I don't understand all of them. I can't figure them all out. But I know that God is in charge. If we have one message that we can leave with this evening, that's the message I'd like to leave you with. And if you'll look at the book of Revelation for next Thursday, the synopsis of the book of Revelation is real simple. God has won. And that's all that Revelation goes all the way through, all those graphic pictures. God is in charge and he has won. Are there problems? Were there problems? Are they going to face difficulties? That's why John wrote the book of Revelation, because they were facing some of the worst persecution they were about to face right at the 100 AD. And John probably wrote that in 96, 92, the book of Revelation. So read it. Don't get buried with the graphics. It's apocalyptic language. One of the few, but we do have some other apocalyptic language. The 7th chapter of Daniel comes to mind. Ezekiel has several passages that are apocalyptic. But generally speaking, the book of Revelation is apocalyptic. The first 2 or 3 chapters are not. The rest of it is. It was a time period in which that kind of language was of value in order to get a point across. That's what Revelation will be all about. That's what our discussion will be. And like I said, it's not simple, but it's not as difficult as we try to make it out to be. And the most important thing is, remember, it was written to an audience that was going to face persecution the very next year. They were going to face persecution 2 years from there, 3 years from now, not 2000. And so when we start making application that says all this is going to happen in the future, let's be careful with that kind of application. Let's figure out what the author was talking about, what his audience received, and what were they going to face, and then, and only then, will we be able to make an application to the here and now. Thank you very much.